Let's kick it off, Duncan.
I'll do away with any formalities because we've got you for 10 minutes. It'd be great if you could leave some time for questions at the end, and I'll hand straight over to you. Kia ora.
Kia ora koutou, tēnā koutou te kōmiti, ko Fitzmaurice-Brown aho, e uri tēnei no te kauri, e airangi, ingarangi, kotirangi me Norway, e hua aho no te tiriti o Waitangi. Kia ora koutou, my name is Fitzmaurice-Brown, a whakapapa tū te Hauri, as well as to Ireland, England, Scotland and Norway. I'm a legal academic at Te Waka, Victoria University, and I oppose this bill unequivocally. For the most part today, though, I'm not going to talk to you about the law. Many of my colleagues have already spoken eloquently about the legal impacts of this bill, and others will continue to do so. I commend to the committee the statements of experts like Ani Makairi, Carwyn Jones, Natalie Coates, Tai Ahu, as well as the findings of the Waitangi Tribunal's report on this bill. Those statements and sources will tell you about how this bill erases Te Tiriti in all but name, how it undermines Tino Rangatiratanga, and how it contradicts its stated purposes of certainty, conversation, and consensus. I agree with those sentiments entirely. But I think all of you, regardless of your parties, already know those things. So instead, I would like to spend my time focusing on what this bill takes away from us all. And to do that, I would like to tell you about my family. As I said in my mihi, I am a product of Te Tiriti o Waitangi. My te Aupari tupuna signed Te Tiriti on the 28th of April, 1840, 150 years to the day before I was born, and 120 years to the day before my mum was born. In 1863, my great-great-great-grandfather Gerald Fitzmaurice, whose last name I share, immigrated to New Zealand. Though the Crown had already failed to honour Te Tiriti by that time, his entry to this country and the life he subsequently made here was a product of that agreement 23 years earlier. I am a product of land confiscations. My Māori ancestors suffered from them, and many of my non-Māori ancestors will have benefited from them. This is the reality of this country's history, and more of us than we would like to admit are implicated in that. I am a product of the native schools era. My great-grandmother had her language beaten out of her, as did so many of her generation. I am a product of the Great Urban Drift. My nana was the last of us to live up north before her family moved to Auckland when she was a teenager. I am the product of so-called integration. My great-grandfather was the Minister of Education who received the Hun Report in 1960, when the government acknowledged that Māori were not in fact a dying race and finally stopped trying to smooth the pillow, but instead turned its efforts to trying to keep us silent. That policy failed too, because I am the product of the Māori Renaissance. My family are not obvious candidates for that label. We grew up knowing we were Māori. We called it part Māori back then, but we never knew our whakapapa. But the ripple effects of the renormalisation of things Māori were felt in our family decades later, as we, alongside thousands of others, learnt by osmosis that we had nothing to be ashamed of. My mother is the product of the treaty settlement era. She encouraged us to embrace our whakapapa, despite knowing little of what that meant. She took tentative steps herself, despite the pain that sometimes involved. As Te Tiriti re-entered public consciousness, it also re-entered our personal consciousness, like a slow but inevitable glacier. My son is a product of Kohanga Reo. He is the first in our family to speak Te Reo Māori for 4 generations. It gives me hope that things can change because he is proof that they already have. He knew about Te Tiriti before he could read. We are all the product of Te Tiriti o Waitangi, Māori and non-Māori, and that is nothing to be afraid of. I'm proud of the resurgence of Te Tiriti in our country, even though it has been imperfect. In part, it is because my work has taught me about the positive impacts of that resurgence, law and policy, but it is also about the impact that it has had on me personally and on the people I care about. So many of my friends and family now have conversations about Te Tiriti o Waitangi that many of us wouldn't have imagined even 10 years ago. When the hikoi reached Wellington last year, my Pākehā dad was right there beside us. Te Tiriti for me remains a source of hope. These are the things that this bill, despite its assurances to the contrary, seeks to remove. Those assurances are a lie, and I think everyone on this committee knows that. The rest of us know that too. So while conversations about the impacts of this bill on law and policy are important because those impacts are numerous and devastating, in my view it is also worth highlighting what is at stake for each of us personally. In diminishing Te Tiriti o Waitangi, this bill diminishes us all. Nō reira, tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you for your time. Toitu Te Tiriti. I'm happy to take questions.
Good, thank you for that submission, Luke. I see we've got a question from Joseph Mooney first, and then Steve Ogle.
Oh, thank you, Luke, for that submission. Look, you raised some really interesting points there, and you point to the diverse whakapapa that you personally have, as do many in this country. And certainly something that's been expressed to me from various people is a uncertainty about their position in New Zealand, depending on which heritage they have. I think everyone's feeling uncertain at the moment, from Māori, non-Māori, and those who are share Māori and European ancestry. So just interested in reflections you have on that, in terms of from that perspective you have with that whakapapa that you've referred to.
Yeah, I think that's one of the great shames and one of the great harms of the way this conversation is currently playing out, and that it's a deliberate, in my view, stoking of fear about the role that Te Tiriti has in excluding people, when, in my view, that's a myth, and Te Tiriti can be this inclusive invitation which invites all of us to be here, Māori and non-Māori, on the simple condition that Te Rangatiratanga is upheld. And that being the case, there's nothing to be afraid of, and in fact, Te Tiriti is not something that was designed to keep people out. It was designed to set the conditions mutually and by consensus on which people can come in. And I think that is part of why I say it's kind of a source of hope. And I think that's a real loss in the way this conversation is currently happening in public.
Just a very brief supplementary, Mr. Chair, just on that
Sorry, Joseph. We've got other questioners. Steve Abel.
Kia ora. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Luke, thanks for your excellent submissions. Great to lay out your own whakapapa like that. Do you think that what we're experiencing now is sort of a blip, another blip in history that will be overwhelmed by this wave of kotahitanga, if you like, of those of us who want to see a nation that honours that founding agreement and is genuinely inspired to march in the streets and stand up for te tiriti?
Yeah, I think so. I think there is this inevitable growing of momentum of people who support te tiriti and don't feel threatened by it. And in part, that is rangatahi. You just heard from one on the committee this morning, you'll hear from others later. I teach te tiriti to some of those. Kai is one of my students who appeared just earlier. And it's students like him and others that give me hope that that wave of momentum is inevitable, but I don't think it's just rangatahi. I spoke briefly about my dad, and I think it's people like his generation that I have seen change as well, and that I have seen that widespread tanga te tiriti embrace of that label and of te tiriti generally. That does give me a sense of inevitability that we are slowly heading towards something better, and at the current moment is just a setback.
Thanks for that. And Takata, final question.
Tēnā koe e ruka I o mahi huhua hei hāpai te tiriti o Waitangi. Now, Luke, you're an educator on matters of te tiriti o Waitangi and naturally the history that came with it. I think my personal view is that what's on display is a clear and open demonstration of the lack of understanding, not only of the nation, but of the people elected to be decision makers. Now, do you think that if MPs were required to have a basic level understanding, and I'm sure you could describe what that would look like, but if MPs were required to have a basic level of understanding that this kind of proposition from one party and the subsequent national corridor that's going on would persist, and do you think if they were required to have a basic understanding that that would be a positive thing for tiriti understanding going forward?
I do think that would be a positive thing. And that I think that's something that would be good for all of us, and of course for our MPs. I actually think there's when you get right into the detail, it's hard to force people to do this because you then run into a few kind of democratic issues. But I think it's also something we should push for the other way. That's a grassroots thing, and that we should demand that of our representatives, regardless of our political parties. Because I think there's a point at which once you grow that understanding, you can't. That reduces the fear of te tiriti. That this climate of fear is the product of a climate of uncertainty, where because this is unknown to people, and we all grew up with treaty myths. I grew up with treaty myths, and that's part of our shared history that we all now need to kind of work together to overcome. But so the short answer to your question is yes, but I think that's also something that we should demand from our representatives of all parties.
Good. Thank you for that, Luke. That brings us to the end of our time. Thank you.
An interesting submission.
Yeah. I feel like we could go a step further than that and not just our elected representatives, but every person in the country, whether you are Māori, whether you are not, whether you are born here, whether you immigrated, everybody should have a foundational, basic understanding of te tiriti so that things like this can't happen. There has been so much fear-mongering.
Yeah, I would say maybe the first people that should go on that course of our MPs in Parliament should be the Taxpayers Union.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm not sure how that would particularly go down well with the Taxpayers Union, but that's something. And actually, the interesting thing is that it is about the generational shift.
Yeah.
There is a generational shift from, say, your parents' era, from, say, our grandparents' era, to our era, to what would be, in our case, yes, we don't have children, but what would be our children's era, if we had any. Your nieces and nephews, I mean, you actually have that. I yet to have that, being the oldest. Well, actually, no, I could say that I've got step nephews, if we count Louis' kids.
Close enough.
Yeah. Grandma's got 2 great-grandchildren, but then at the same time they grew up in Australia, so they don't know a damn single thing about Treaty of Waitangi, even that they have 2 Kiwi parents. Because they were also in that era that really didn't have it taught that well. So, I mean, it would be one of how to sit there and do that. I mean, we already know people get up in arms of Māori Language Week when the town names are in Te Reo Māori instead of English.
Because it's so hard to look at the signs that you've always looked at.
Oh, I know. Or the one of the, was it Martai Smith?
Or at
Smith.
least the common name.
Yeah. Or you had Marto Smith's show 9 Lives, and he said there are going to be 2 groups of viewers. Those who are going to sit down there and yell and scream at the TV with the correct answer, and there's going to be that other group of people who are going to yell and scream because of Te Reo Māori.
Yeah.
And and I know when I got my grandma to watch it, and she said, "Hey, at least I was the one yelling out the right answer, not the one yelling out about the tornado." Like grandma said, and I told her about the interview, and she's like, "I'm gonna make sure I'm the one yelling the right answer and not complaining about the tornado." And she said she found so much out about New Zealand from that TV show that otherwise may have not been on there. But I mean, grandma likes her quiz TV shows and game show type of things.
I don't blame her. When
it depends on
the actual TV. I am addicted to quiz shows.
Yeah, but it's the type of quiz show. It's like The Chase.
Yeah.
But like if it was just some boring one that doesn't have questions or that sort of thing, like she's not really that much of a fan. Like I don't think she watches Wheel of Fortune or that sort of thing. She's more The Chase. I don't think Jeopardy is on TV over here, but she probably would watch Jeopardy.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, considering that's about questions, that's about expanding knowledge.
Yeah.
Yeah. Or like she watches Tipping Point, but she watches Tipping Point because they actually have decent.
Thanks for watching. Make sure you're subscribed to our Facebook.